This last section, if you remember, is about carbon, and we're going to look at the most simple carbons, which are called hydrocarbons, in this little tutorial. But you've seen some of this already because we've talked about it in class. So we know that hydrocarbons, basically the challenge on this is just learning the names, because what we're looking at and some of the terminology, we're looking at different basic structural components of a lot of other molecules, but looking at them in their very simplest form. So we can look at hydrocarbons, meaning they just have carbon and hydrogen, and we can name them according to the way they bond together and the way the number of carbons they have, and whether or not they have single bonds or double bonds or even triple bonds. So anything that's a chain of carbons with hydrogens around it is called an aliphatic hydrocarbon. And if they have single bonds, as you can see all of the ones on the right have, then the ending of the name, so we use these root names, but then the ending will always be A-N-E. So if you have something called propane, you know that prop means that it has 3 carbons, and the A-N-E ending tells you they're all single bonded. Here's some double bonds, though, so we know that they also can form compounds with double bonds, and those have a different ending. So the prefix or root names are the same. However, we put the E-N-E at the terminus, and that tells us that it has a double bond somewhere. So notice that butene, which has 4 carbons, only has 1 double bond here. So we aren't talking about the number of double bonds. We're just looking at the fact it has any. So there are other naming rules that would tell us where double bonds are or how many there might be, but for our purposes, we don't need that now. But the one thing that does relate to double bonds is this thing called cis and trans, which we'll go through more in class because this is probably really hard to understand just based on these figures. But I'll show you in practical terms why we care and what that actually looks like on a much bigger example of a molecule. If some of these hydrocarbons can form these cyclic structures, we actually call these aromatics. They have the same root name again, depending on the number of carbons. So the points here on each one of these would be carbons. So on this cyclohexane, we have 6 carbons around here, and they're all connected. And I know they all have single bonds because I have the A-N-E ending. But this one down here, cyclohexene, has a double bond, and we can see that right here. Now what you don't see on this is the hydrogens that would be attached to this. So remember that carbon has to have 4 bonds. If it's bonding to another carbon or double bonding to another carbon, that's fine, but it also would then fill in any of the bonds it doesn't bond to yet with hydrogen if it's a hydrocarbon. Here's the simplest of all hydrocarbons, that's methane. You can see its structure. It has a sort of tetrahedral geometry. Here's some other examples, all still considered aliphatic because they're just chain types of, whether even if it's 1 or 2, that's still considered a straight chain of hydrocarbons. Though the difference with this one here, with ethene, with the double bond, is that it has a different geometry. Notice it's planar, and that it doesn't rotate. And I'll show you this in a model in class. So double bonds are stiffer, they're harder to move, and so the geometry is more rigid. Here's the aromatics, or cyclic versions of hydrocarbons. So you can see them all nicely displayed here, and you can see kind of what the rules might be depending on whether or not they have single bonds or double bonds, or alternate single and double bonds. So these are all single, and cyclopentane, cyclohexane, all single bonds. Here's benzene, it has its own name. Notice it still has these 6 carbons, so much like cyclohexane, except it's alternating double and single bonds. And then there's another one here, this pyridine, which we'll talk about later, but notice it has a nitrogen kind of snuck in there instead of carbon. So an isomer, iso means the same and mer means unit. So isomers are basically have the same chemical formula, but there's something different about the way they're arranged. So there's structural isomers, such as you see here, geometric isomers. And then these funny ones, these enantiomers, which basically are mirror images of each other. So three-dimensional, you have to think three-dimensionally on this, but if you put this L version, this L isomer next to a mirror, then you would see the D, but they can't impose on one another, so they're mirror images. Those are enantiomers. Oh yeah, I forgot to fix this for you guys, but at any rate, so we'll talk about cis and trans very particularly when we look at fats and what that actually causes in the structure of these bigger molecules. So we see this is a hydrocarbon chain. The red part we aren't talking about right now, but what you see is one of them is straight and one of them has a kink in it, it's bent. And that one that has the kink in it, that's bent, is the one we're kind of, we like a little bit better because this is better for us health-wise, where the trans, the straight chain, is not as good. It's more of a what we call a saturated fat, which is a problem. Now, the bending actually has to do with the double bonding. So we'll get to this, but just this is an introduction to it. Here's another example of the enantiomers. And now we're on to the real topic, which is this one right here. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I'm still good. I had to be sure I was still recording. So now we're on to functional groups. So given that you have one of these carbon sort of skeletons, these things we just said were hydrocarbons, we can substitute other groups, other parts of molecules to create something different. And so what we look at functional groups are some kind of a basic structure that when put somewhere on these hydrocarbon chains forms a compound of real functional relevance, something that we're really interested in finding out about. And so we're going to study this quite a bit. You can see on this table it's not very clear, so I think I put it on the next slide too, a little bigger version of it, that if we have an OH group, which is called a hydroxyl group, and this has structural formula, it is a component on things we call alcohols. So here they give the example of ethanol. So if you think about ethane, if we looked at went back to the hydrocarbons and you found out what is ethane, and then you see this substituting for one of those hydrogens, so we have an OH group instead, or a hydroxyl group, that's a characteristic of something that has the quality of an alcohol. There's one called a carboxyl, which is C-double-O-H. Structurally, it looks like this, with a carbon and a double bonded oxygen, and again, what looks like a hydroxyl group. This acts as a unit. And that's something we find on acids, such as vinegar. There's an amino group, NH2. That's a structure. And we find this in bases. Remember, we looked at that acid-base scale. There's another one called a sulfohydryl. I'm not going to go into this one until later. And a phosphate, which is going to be super important. Notice the phosphate group has a P for phosphorus and 4 oxygens around it, 2 of which actually have a charge on them. And they form one of the most important molecules in life, which is called ATP. And then finally, something called a carbonyl group, or carbonyl group, which there's 2 forms of it depending on if it's on the very end of a molecule or whether it's somewhere in the middle. But it's a carbon with a double bonded oxygen. And it'll look like this if it's at the end. And it will look like this if it's somewhat embedded in the midst of some other carbons. So these form things called aldehydes and ketones. So this picture here, I just put this one in, you don't have it in your slide set, kind of runs through some of these macromolecules, and every single one of them has a carbon hydrogen, somewhat of a hydrocarbon structure, basic structure, with different additions on it that change what it is. So you can see here is a hydroxyl group on this one. There's a number of hydroxyl groups, those OHs. On this one, here's an amino group, and here's a carboxyl group. So you'll start to recognize these the more we see some of the molecules. This one has an aromatic structure on it. This is it's a compound called phenylalanine. Don't worry, don't stress, you don't need to know that one yet. And then we see also this idea that functional groups can form hydrogen bonds between them, and that will help to stabilize certain structures, such as the structure of DNA. So very important. Again, all of this is somewhat of a preview, but you need to have at least an understanding of what's a functional group. And that's it.